welcome back to the KJ Methods YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to all who may be struggling to pass that real estate exam. We're going to do a short video today on what I call the Prorations Hack. Why do I call it a hack? Because so often when I'm teaching prorations, students do not understand or remember which side of the timeline they should be counting. And so I made these diagrams to help students remember what side they should be counting. We always count the side of the timeline of the person who owes the money, but that doesn't always resonate with students. So let's take a look at these timelines that I've created. The first one, if you get a taxes or insurance paid question, and you're always going to assume that it's been paid unless they tell you that it has not been paid, then what you do, I'm going to use a laser pointer here, is you count this side of the timeline. I have some notes here. We divide these timelines by 365 all the time, unless you're told something different in the test question, and you are going to give the buyer a debit and the seller is going to get a credit. Why is that? Because the buyer moving into the house, the seller paid for this entire year, and so we have to give that seller some money back for that period of time. So taxes and insurance paid, count the right-hand side of the timeline. How about taxes or insurance unpaid? You're only going to assume unpaid if the test question says to you unpaid. The other terminology they use is arrears. Arrears just means billed backwards. It hasn't been paid yet. And so if it hasn't been paid yet, let's think about it. The seller's been living there, but they haven't paid it yet. So let's count this side of the timeline. The seller's been living there and then they're going to close, right? And so we're going to count this side of the timeline. This situation, the seller would then be debited and the buyer would be credited. So when the buyer gets that money from the seller, the buyer is then going to be able to pay those taxes. The next one is rent. This one always makes students confused, but I want you to first understand that rent means there's one landlord selling the property to another landlord. We're not really talking about the tenants per se. We're just saying one landlord is taking over this property after another landlord is selling it. Well, if the landlord is taking over the property, shouldn't that landlord get a portion of the rent for the time they own it? Yes, they should. And so we're going to count this side. When this landlord comes in here, right? When the landlord comes in here, we're going to say that this landlord is going to be entitled to this amount for the period of time that they own it, for that month. The other thing you want to keep in mind when we talk about rent is we only have a month timeline. We don't do that 365 days. We just have a month timeline when rent, and we count the number of days that the rent is doing for that particular month. So for example, if there is April, we would count for 30 days, but if it was May, it would be 31 days, okay? And this, of course, is going to be a buyer credit, and a seller debit. So it's kind of weird, right? Because it's the opposite, it's the opposite side that we're counting, but we're still saying that the seller is going to be debited in this situation because it's not fair for him to keep the money for the entire month when he's not owning the property for the entire month. The next one is accrued interest. Accrued interest is always the seller. Always the seller. These are fairly easy to do, but you want to make sure that you remember the accrued interest is the left-hand side, and it goes from the due date to the closing date. So for example, if it was June 1st to June 30th, and the closing was June 10th, 10 days, June 1st to June 10th. We always count from the due date to the closing date. Remember that the seller always has accrued interest. There's never a day of the month that the seller doesn't have accrued interest, even if it is one day. And don't get tricked by this. When it's accrued interest, we're not talking about seller buyer. We're talking about the seller and their bank. So if anything, it is money that is taken from the seller, debited from the seller, and given to the bank. And then the last one here would be prepaid interest, which is the buyer's side. So what's happening at a closing? The seller is paying off his loan, and that would be accrued interest. The buyer is taking a new loan. That would be prepaid interest. And so when we're talking about prepaid interest, we're counting the right-hand side of the timeline. And we go from the actual closing date to the end of the month. The actual closing date to the end of the month. And so let's use that example again. June 1st through June 30th. Accrued interest, the seller side would be June 1st to June 10th. What would be the prepaid interest? June 10th to June 30th. All right, so the seller gets the left side, the buyer gets the right side. And again, this is not buyer and seller because the seller is paying off his loan, the buyer is taking a new loan from their new bank. And so if anything, it is a buyer debit and a credit to their bank. All right, so that's it for today. Those are what I call the proration hacks, just so you can remember what side of the timeline you should be counting. That really should help you. It helps many of my students at least get an idea of what side they should be counting, because too often students make a mistake and count the wrong side. All right, so don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video for all who may be struggling to pass their real estate exam. Thank you for coming by the KJ Method. We will see you next time.